Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1149. I'm sorry, 1120. What's that? 1249. Sorry, 1249. Aleph Reish Mem Tes, which began Ubira Inyan after explaining how not only the midas of the person, the emotions, are elevated and shaped by Gadlus Abba, which means, in simple English, the transcendent and resonating experience of the higher reality of Arich and Atik, of the superconscious and beyond, all the way from Atzmus Ein Sof, that comes through the B'chol Ma'idecha, a love that is completely passionate and all-consuming, that goes into the Pnimius and Atzmus HaNeshama, which in turn elevates the mind to these highest levels. And the mind then transmits its power into these midas, but also into Malchus, as he explained in the previous page. Malchus, the Malchus too benefits from this. So we're talking now a great high level of Malchus that he called Ata Yigdol Nokoyach Adnai. At last page he called it Ata Yigdol Nokoyach, that now Koyach Adnai gets strength and gets power. Hagadolas HaKoyach Shuam Shachas B'chinas Atzmus Ein Sof B'Malchus Al Yidei HaMitzvos. And then he used before also the expression Ha'atorah She'itra Lo Imay, the crown that the mother, Bina, crowns the Chassan, B'yem Chasanose, like he says, because the Hamshach of Zah is specifically for Malchus, that's the ultimate purpose. And that's what's done through Avodah. So that led to the next section, Ubira Inyan, which we learned yesterday, that in Eitz Chaim it says, and he brings from the Torah that there are 3 levels. Ibur Yunika Meichin are 3 Yechudim, Yichud of Havaya and Adnai. The Yichud of Havaya and Elikim that's Ibur. Yunika is the second Aliyah, is the Yichud Havaya and Elikim, and the third highest is Yichud Havaya and Eya. And the Alter Rebbe in Torah says that these are Biti Achesi Imi, based on the Medrash, the example of the king speaking about his daughter, the princess, which he explains is Aliyah of Malchus. Aliyah number 1, she's called daughter, and she's Makabel, like a daughter receives from Zah, means from Elikus, from basically Havaya would be Zah, and Biti would be Adnai. That's Havaya Adnai, the first level. And that is the bittul, it's a level, it's a higher level, because the Biti is she's not just a daughter on her own, but just like the male leaves his father and mother in order to to marry and build his own life, so too the Nekeva, which is Malchus, leaves her family, so to speak, in order to connect and be bottled to the Mashpia, which is Malchus. So that's level number 1. Level number 2 is that the elevation of Malchus, that it becomes equal stature. So like Chassan and Kala, equal stature to Zah, not just as a bas, a daughter, which is which is bottle and receives, but equal shava became Moshe, he says, and then it's called achesi, and that is how Malchus also receives from Chabad, just like Zah does. So they're both receiving from Chabad. That would be the yichud of Havaya and Elikim. And then the Eid Aliyah Yeshek Dela, the highest elevation, is when Malchus goes even higher than Zah, becomes like the level of Bina, Imi, and she's mashpia in Zah. So it's receiving from Zah, equal to Zah, and now being mashpia into the midas, like a mother that nurtures her child. But here it's not the level of Yanika, it's the level of Moichin, the godless, and the aim is level, she becomes like Bina, mashpes lazah. So Malchus is now become a mashpia to the midas. So Malchus has elevated to the level of Bina. Now, we're going to learn now is what this means in Avodah. All of these are levels. And this would be the yichud of Havaya and Eya, which is higher than Havaya. So till now is Havaya and Adnai, which is Malchus in its place. Havaya and Elikim is Malchus as it's equal to Zoh. And Havaya Eya would be Malchus as it elevates Bina higher than Zoh and Mashpia to Zoh. So really it's three elevations in the level of Malchus, which of course are consistent to what we've learned. That the highest level is where Malchus becomes connected to the Meichin, to Bina, and which Bina, as we learned, also goes through these stages. Bina as it relates to the emotions, and then Bina how it stands side by side with Chochmah as they gaze at Arich and Atik, which draws the energy of Atik. So that's what we learned yesterday. Now he's going to explain. Ubiya Gimel Madreges Elu, Ba'aveda, the explanation of these three levels in Aveda is the following. Hine Bas, what's Bas in Aveda? Shehi, B'chinas Makabel, she, as we said, is a Makabel. When you say someone's a daughter is a recipient of her parents. Here in this case, the Melech says, I love this child of mine so much until I call her my daughter. But a daughter is a Makabel and is expected to honor the parent. But in Aveda is the inyan of being B'chinas Makabel. And what is that in Aveda? Hu inyan ha-mitzvos. This is the mitzvahs that an neshama does, follows the orders and the mitzvahs that the Eibishter tells her to do. And when it's in that state, it's a state of bas, makabel, like he said before, bottle. So it's a state of bittul. I just want to read the exact words. V'dovak is haliyah midas haliyah is b'chinas bas b'chinas makabel uksheli. Right. He said the words bittul somewhere, if I recall. Okay, good. So this is the level of mitzvahs. Now he's going to explain why. Why is this the level of mitzvahs? Mitzvahs are a level of kelim. A mitzvah means God had desire, a will. His will is that we should do a mitzvah, to do the different taryag mitzvahs, whether it's the mitzvah of learning Torah, or the mitzvah of putting on tefillin, or the mitzvah of Shabbos, or kashrus, or whatever mitzvah it is. So the mitzvahs are considered, and they're considered to be kelim. Ukamesha kosav, and he brings proof for this, kiner mitzvah v'teira er. So the pasuk in Mishlei says, mitzvah is compared to a ner mitzvah, the candle of mitzvah, and Teira is called Teira, the light. What's the difference between Neir and Oir? He says, Shamitzvus nikra Neir b'chinas keli. Neir is like the container, like the vessel for the Oir of Teira. So Teira is divine light. And the mitzvahs are like a Neir that is the container, the receptacle, so to speak, where the flame is ignited and lit. That has the wick and has the oil in it, the keli. So that's what a ner is. A ner is the candle. Ukamaimer, like it says, this is from Zoyar. Ramach Pikudin, the Alter Rebbe brings this in Tanya in chapter 4. Ramach Pikudin, Ramach Evorin de Malka. The 248 Pikudin means commandments. It's talking about the positive commandments. Mitzvos Esa, they are the Ramach Evorin de Malka. 248 Evorim are organs or limbs of the king. So it's not just the Eibishter is telling us these are the mitzvahs I want you to do. They're actually so-called components of the Melech himself. And that's why we say that the Ramach mitzvahs, the 248 limbs in a person correspond to the 248 mitzvahs, because the mitzvahs themselves are essentially God's limbs. Now, obviously not physical, spiritual, but they are an extension of and essentially carry what are the limbs of a body, the limbs and organs of a body. They're kelim. They're kelim for what? For the neshama, the life force that lives within them, that dwells within them. So the same thing, the mitzvahs are the Evarim, the Malka, they are the kelim for the divine energy that flows through these mitzvahs. So we're establishing here that mitzvahs are compared to kelim, which he's going to explain is the level of biti, of bas, the daughter. B'chinas evarim v'kelim. Evarim, that it's a level of evarim, of like organs or limbs, and kelim. Basically equating evarim to kelim, because an aver is, again, let's talk about a person's hand, for example. That's an aver, an arm. An arm without a neshama is just a lifeless piece of meat, piece of flesh. So it's a keli. What's a neshama without the evarim? It's a amorphous soul that doesn't have a place to rest. When the neshama comes into a body and it develops through the 9 months of pregnancy, what's happening is that the life force is connecting with the container, and they come together, you'll have a living organism. Like when we said, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. But what happened first? God took Ofer min ha'adama, he took earth from the ground, and he made that into a keli. That would be the keli, the receptacle. And then within it, he breathed, he blew, he breathed, and imbued it with the divine breath, which is life. And suddenly this piece of earth became alive. So evarim are compared to kelim, and mitzvahs are, as he said, meir, and now second proof, like evarim. So evarim v'kelim, and the parenthesis he adds, as shall be explained. In other words, the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain later why mitzvahs are compared to this evarim and kelim. Ulechein, and therefore, ha-mitzvahs and b'chinas ma'aseh dafke. That's why mitzvahs are specifically manifest in action. They're not abstract, they are driven by action. She'ena yetze klal b'kavanas ha-mitzvahs u'biyediyas seda mitzvahs. A person does not perform a mitzvah, he's not yetze at all, if he just has the intention of the mitzvah or the knowledge of the secret or the hidden message, the seid, the mystical or the esoteric of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is performed only when you have the action. In the action, kavana adds dimensions, as he explains in Tanya, chapter 38 and on. But that's after you have an action. If a person will say, instead of putting on tefillin, I'm going to contemplate on shibud halev ha'meach, I'm going to bind my mind and heart, which is the kavon. Or instead of sitting in a sukkah physically, I'm going to think about leman yedu de'resechem, that the Jews sat in huts. Either they were surrounded by the clouds of glory or actual huts in the time when they left Mitzrayim, but you don't actually sit in a sukkah. Or a person, instead of eating matzah on Pesach, contemplates on the kavanah, the intentions and the secret, deeper meanings of matzah, bittul, or whatever it may be, but does not actually eat the mitzvah, the matzah. He does not, it's considered la yotza klum. There's nothing was achieved. If you have the action and then you have intention, all these intentions I just said, then, like he explains in Tanya from Zoyar, then the kavanah gives it a neshama, makes it alive, and is like wings that carry it. But like he explains, wings does not make a bird. You first need a bird, and then you have wings. That's why in halacha, even a bird with only one wing is still a bird. In other words, the kavanah elevates it. But you first need to have the action which manifests. Now, just for the record, you'll say, what about mitzvahs that are not action-based? Let's say learning Torah. V'debarta bam. So first of all, akimas svasav hava maisa. When a person speaks, that's considered a form of action. Secondly, that's the action of that mitzvah. Some mitzvahs are performed by actually doing it with action. Some are performed by saying it. Some are performed by thinking about it. Like v'haftarecha kamecha is a mitzvah. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a physical way where you, hachnasa sarchim is physical, you invite a guest. But loving another is an emotion. But that itself is also an action, the action of actually feeling love to someone, besides helping them and doing it in action. In other words, the bottom line is mitzvahs need some level of performance. But generally speaking, most mitzvahs have real maisa in them, action. Even those that don't, that is also considered action because it's a performance. It's not just a theory. So it says mitzvahs hem bechinas maisa dafke, and you're not yetzer at all with the intention and with the knowledge of the seid ha-mitzvah, the secret or the deeper dimensions of this mitzvah. Kim dafke b'maisa b'peil mamish. That's how a mitzvah is done. The ikka kim ha-mitzvahs. So what we have established so far is that mitzvahs are like kelim, Now he went further and said that that's why mitzvahs are maisa, because a maisa is like the keli to bring Elokus down. It's not just on Oyl. He says in Tanya, I think in chapter 40 or 39 or 38 even. In one of those chapters, he says in the Hagah that Yedua, the Maisa mitzvah is the Keli, the Kavonas mitzvah is the Oyl. But without a Keli, the Oyl is it's like a neshama without a guf. It can't do a mitzvah. So the Maisa mitzvah, he says, Olachein, because you could say, what's the connection between the fact that mitzvahs are Kelim and the next line, that's why they're Maisa, because Maisa is a Keli. The Maisa creates a Keli. It's an action. If somebody wants to build a home and they contemplate and meditate on it, you're not going to have a home. You need to have some action to be able to build a home. And that action is the Keli. So therefore, mitzvahs are a state of Maisa. And now he adds furthermore, V'ikar kima mitzvahs, and the primary fulfillment of mitzvahs, who b'chinas Kabolas Oyl dafke, is specifically Kabolas Oyl. In other words, not al pi seichel, but you're accepting the yoke of heaven. Kabolas Oyl malchus shamayim means Kabolas Oyl. I accept the yoke. Basically, that you're following what Hashem wants. One second. This is a parenthesis. Okay, it goes a few lines, but he's adding now that it's Kabolas Oyl, and he's going to add that this itself makes it more of a keli. So let's read the parentheses. In other words, if you do a mitzvah in action, if you don't have action, you don't have anything, like he said. If you do a mitzvah in action, but there's no Kabolas Oyl, at least you have the action. But he says the primary place where the dafki ikra keli l'gileh. Kabolas Oyl is the primary keli for the gileh that a mitzvah is mamshich. Ukiyadua, and he explains why. The Kabolas Oyl machal shamayim, who yised ha'aveda, is the foundation of aveda, as he says in Tanya chapter 41. In other words, if you don't have the idea that you're accepting what God wants, a person is not going to have the real foundation that does aveda. They may do it for ulterior motives, for reward, or to be accepted by others, or because you're educated that way. But the true performance of mitzvahs is based on, why would a person do a mitzvah? Because they accept the melech that's commanding us to do that mitzvah. It's like when the Jews stood at Sinai and they said, Nasa v'nishma. That's classic Kabolas Oyl. I'm not waiting to understand. I do it because I accept and respect what the melech wants of me. And he wants me to do this. This is what I do. This doesn't mean you can't understand it or explain it and so on. But the yesod, like he says, you say the Aveda that the you say the Aveda shekola giluyim b'meir b'lev ba'asogav izbonenus elu, because all the revelations that come in the mind and in the heart, like hasog and the comprehension, v'izbonenus and the contemplation elu, hasog v'izbonenus elu, in this comprehension and contemplation about God and so on that we've been learning about, ubeseres avavira, and the stimulation or the awakening of love and reverence. Who dafka kishyesha yesod the Kabolas Oyl machal shamayim. That's dafka when you have a foundation. In other words, the foundation of a building holds up the building, and then upon the foundation you build the floors, which are the mind and the emotions. But what does it stand on? What does it all rest upon? Is the Kabolas Oyl machal shamayim, that is the foundation of everything. You start with saying, Asher kedeshanu v'mitzvos v'tzivonu. You start by saying, I accept what Eibishter wants, and then that in turn informs the mind and the emotions. Now it's true, a person can contemplate and come to godliness even through just purely the mind, but that too requires some Kabolas Oyl. Why would a person who's involved in the other matters suddenly contemplate on godliness? Because you're respecting it in some way. So bottom line is the yesod is Kabolas Oyl machal shamayim. And again, you could come from seichel to Kabolas Oyl, but the true foundation of all aveda is Kabolas Oyl. U'kamoy kain ikar hashuv lahamshel gilei elokus lamata. And the same thing, ikar hashuv. Remember, we learned the ratzeh and shuv. The ratzeh is the yearning and the longing, the passion to be encompassed in godliness, to be absorbed. And the primary shuv of bringing godliness into the world is also who became a mitzvahs. That's how you do it. When a person is completely consumed and the neshama wants to become part of godliness, you're not bringing godliness down to the world. You're going up. So the shuv, to draw the kus lamata, is also became a mitzvahs. And that's rak b'chdei liyachda k'shebricha v'shchinta b'tachtenim. This is on top of page 1250. I turned the page. And that is in order to unite the k'shebricha v'shchinta dafke b'tachtenim. And that is also Kabolas Oyl. Why would a person who is so passionately consumed with godliness want to come down? Because you were told to. The ultimate bittul. It's not about you. He says, that's the level of yirat tato, the lower reverence and the higher reverence. And I think this is also hinting to what we learned on top of page 1247, that after you have this deep desire to want to be encompassed in godliness, then comes the ava b'tanugim, that in a form of shuv, like he brought from chapter 10, the end of chapter 10, that it's not sufficient just to elevate, but to come back down. And all this is driven by yira and Kabolas Oyl. So what does this add? He says in this parentheses that that's why the Ikar Keli, the Gilia is Kabolas Oyl. Because without it, you don't really have the building, the strong foundation of receiving godliness and also drawing godliness downward. Yeah. To put it in the words that he used earlier in Ayin Beis, that for a person, it's expression that ein emdim is lispal el metech keved reish. A person doesn't go to daven unless they have keved reish, means a heavy head, but it means, as Rashi says there, hachnoa v'shiflus. You have to have an element of submission and humility. It's like it says, without being a clay reikon, if you're not an empty container and a vessel to receive, you won't receive. A full cup can be filled. So all Avodah is based on having the Kabolas Oyl, that I'm ready to receive something greater than I am. God is telling me to do mitzvahs. I am ready to accept that. That's Kabolas Oyl. So Maisa mitzvahs, which he's explaining here, is all about kelim. The ultimate keli is when you are ready to accept that. If a person is very content and fulfilled, why would they empty themselves? Kabolas Oyl is the ultimate bittul that empties and turns you into a receptacle to receive that which is beyond and greater than you are. The Torah of God's will and God's plan. So bottom line, so far what we've established is the following. The mitzvahs, that bas is the level of mitzvahs, mekabel, because mitzvahs are containers, like the organ, like the limbs. Ner mitzvah, like the candle, like the limbs. And that's why they manifest in Maisa, ha-mitzvahs. And not just in the oir of intentions and the energy, but in a container of action that creates a container for it. And especially that the foundation of it all is, of mitzvahs is Kabolas Oyl, which creates also the receptacle, the primary receptacle, upon which is built everything that follows: the mind, the heart, the contemplation, the comprehension, the contemplation, and the emotions of the moyach and the love. Okay. So let me continue, and then I'm going to stop shortly for any questions, but let me just finish the topic. It's all coming to explain biti, bas. Second line on page 1250. If you're if you want to follow the text and you don't have it, you go to ayinbeis.com, you have all the text there. So he says, eved. So he's now introducing the word eved, servant. This Aveda is not like a ben, a son, that feels close. But this is the Aveda b'derech Avedas Eved, a servant that feels that servitude, an element of obligation. He serves with reverence and Kabolas Oyl, and acceptance and submission. U'kumoy al derech moshel, like for example, Avedis Eved, hurak l'kayim rotzen hamelech. Like for example, when you talk about a king and a servant of the king. The servant of the king is only to fulfill the desire of the king. Without having any awareness or knowledge for the reason of why he comes. The king commands something, the servant doesn't ask why. He does it, he performs it dutifully, with complete submission, complete acceptance. He doesn't do it due to any reason, only to perform the ratzon. That's his job. That's called complete Kabolas Oyl, Avedis Eved. Okay. He's now going to go further and explain in this mashal the difference between a servant and a minister, and one of the so-called more higher level staff members of the king's domain, the king's palace. You know what? Since I've been reading it for a little while, if anybody has any questions still here. Obviously, he hasn't yet concluded the point of why this is called daughter, Biti, my daughter, but you see he's going toward that, Malchus as being a makabel, not a mashpia, not equal and not a mashpia, but as a makabel. So that's what, even though Biti you can say is not an eved, so daughter is like a son, but nevertheless, here the emphasis is on the Kabolas Oyl of this child, of this daughter, but he hasn't yet concluded that point. And we will get there, but I'll stop here if anybody wants any clarity or any clarification of the points we've learned so far from the bottom of page 1249. If not, I'll just continue on. Okay. So now he says, the Zeu ha'hefresh ben Eved l'sar. And this is the difference between a servant. A sar is a har, is a minister or a sarim, are they are the more the staff members, you can say, or the ministers and the advisors of the king. Like the ministers of an empire, of a kingdom. Their role and their value is because they know they are experts. It doesn't say experts. They're aware of how you run a kingdom. They're not just action-based like a servant. They betam v'seichel. How you run a kingdom, betam with reason and seichel with intelligence, strategy. Al kol dovar, on every matter. So like when you say Pare had a sar hamashkim, he had a what's it called? The sar hamashkim, sar ha'efim. He had a baker. He was the minister of baked goods and the minister of drink, meaning wine and so on. So these are people who are experts in their field. Or you have what you call a foreign minister, or a commerce minister. I mean, in the United States, we call them secretary of state, defense secretary, etc., etc. These are ministers in the kingdom that have absolutely, like he says, they know how to run. They're trained and know how to run. Betam v'seichel al kol davar, with reason and intelligence, every matter that they are involved in. And their performance, who al piatam, are according to reason. That he does something, he implements and does whatever strategies that they implement, due to the logical, compelling logical argument, that compels and says and dictates, that's how it has to be. So let's say there's a economic recession. So a person who is a minister of the economy, a finance minister, what he will do with his staff, they will evaluate the situation and they'll come up with a plan. They're not just implementing action, that the king said, do this. They are part of the whole advisory and the strategic and research and everything necessary, to the point that the Seichel will tell them how to implement. Shetzarich li is Cain. And through this type of plan and plan of action, this will give an advantage Through this, it will benefit and improve Inyan HaMelucha, the kingdom, the kingship. That's what their role is, to improve the government, to improve the quality and the welfare of the kingdom. V'adarab, he adds down a parenthesis. And on the contrary, Hasad ain't tzarich lasis rak kafi hatzivui. Not only does the Sar work with intelligence and planning and ideas and reasoning, he actually is not supposed to do things just by command. If a minister just follows orders, he won't fulfill his job. His job is to evaluate and understand and bring his expertise to do the best possible way. If he just follows orders, in other words, he's complete like a rubber stamp, or doesn't even think about it, he says that's what he says. To understand the intention and the command that let's say the king says, improve the economy, or do this. He needs to understand the intention in that tzivui. Ulasis kafiya kavana. He has to understand and do it according to this kavana. He has to understand the deeper intention. The Eved doesn't need to know the intention of the king. He doesn't need to know the reasoning. He doesn't need to know anything. Go do this job. He's like a foot soldier and just performs. In the case of Assad, he's not supposed to just follow. He has to understand the reasoning behind it and do it according to that deeper reason to make sure it's aligned with that kavanah. Certainly he also is subject, he's a king's subject and also has to perform the king's will. And nevertheless, he's not like a servant. So below he says, David v'Yayav, which is most likely. David, Yayav was his head of his military. Besof, Shmuel Beis. So you see, in Shmuel Beis, Yayav was not just a servant. Yayav was an advisor. Yayav strategized with David HaMelech. He consulted with him. So even though the king is one, the ministers are not the king. They too are subject to listen to him, but they have to also add their intelligence in order to implement it properly and their strategy. And he gives the example of David and Yayav, his chief of staff, his chief of the military. At the end of Shmuel Beis, where he talks about their different planning and so on. This is the parentheses. So the parentheses adds that not only does he use his seichel, but he must use his seichel and can't just follow orders. Even though, obviously, he's implementing these orders, but he's doing it together with a whole plan, intelligent plan. These Sodim, these ministers are called the king's advisors. All the matters of the kingdom, meaning all matters of government and ruling and everything that happens, nichtachim means literally are established. Al pi hasarim b'chol hamishpatim. I'm sorry, al pi hasarim according to the advice of these ministers. In other words, they're not just on the sidelines. They are involved in all the laws that are being written. Nichtachim means that they're laws that are inscribed. Nichtachim literally means cut out, but established. That these become forged is the right word. They become forged according to these ministers, these advisors. B'chol hamishpatim, it's all the laws of the land. Sheben ish l're'eu, between a person and another person and his friend. Bein b'momen, both financially. Ubein b'nefoshes, and both in matters of nefoshes means life and death, matters that affect life. Yishpetu heim bevad hamishpet shelehem. They will all be measured, they will all be evaluated and judged and established in the vad hamishpet shelehem, in the court of law of these ministers. So these ministers are involved in actually writing the laws and establishing the laws. Like, for example, you talk about the Supreme Court in the United States, or all the courts of the United States. These are all government officials, and they are not just servants whose role is to implement. They actually write laws. Now, obviously, it's based on, okay, we don't have a king, we have a president, We have different houses. But in the world of monarchy, it was the king that was the leader. He, in turn, delegates to his different experts. Obviously, he has the final say, but they are very much involved in writing laws. You see the story of Haman and Achashverosh. Haman was a minister, as was Mordechai. And when Haman convinced Achashverosh, God forbid, to do the Gzera, what happened? Haman went and got these laws written. Achashverosh signed it and sealed it. But the advisor is very much involved in the governance of the nation, of the empire. So you see a Sar is very different than an Eved in that sense, to the point Vada Mishpat Shalem means Vad means they're a court of law, basically. V'chein yaskim hamelech achakach, like I just said, and after they write these laws or suggest these laws, then afterwards the king agrees. V'lo yishana es mishpatim al pi harev, and generally he will not change their evaluation, their determination. If they come up with a certain conclusion in law, generally al pi harev, he won't change it. Obviously, the king can change it, and he does overrule it at times, and veto power. But generally, he won't change their mishpat, which shows you that they do have actual contribution here on a level of strategic level, writing the laws. This is the mashal. And what's the nimshal, the moral? The Medrash says, Malchusa derekei ke'ein Malchusa de'ara, or Malchusa de'ara ke'ein Malchusa derekia, that the kingdom below is similar to the kingdom above. So when we learn all these mishalim in Chassidus, in Medrash, like here, the king and his daughter is a mashal of a melech. There are hundreds of such examples. So I remember Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Mem Aleph, which would be what is it, Mem Aleph? 41 years ago. The Rebbe spoke about this. He actually was Magia, that Sikh. He talked to that Malchus Adar came Malchus Derekia because the Eibishter wanted for us to have an example of how he works. So this too reflects how it is in Malchus Derekia. Now we're going to go back to Aveda, Malchus above. Now, what do we know about this? The Chen Hu, he says, similarly, it's in the heavenly kingdom. Kihine. What is the Eved and the Sar in the heaven above? How does that work? He says, Malchus Karin. We call Teresh Shabbat Peh Malchus. We say that in Pasuk Eliyahu. He mentioned it before, and close to the bottom of page 1248. He said Teresh Shabbat Peh Karin Lo Peh. The Amshachas of Torah of Oyl in the halachas of Torah. So we're going to see the Melech b'mishpat Yamed Aretz. He's going to explain why. The Melech, how does he establish Yamed Aretz? How does he establish the land? Is b'mishpat, through the rule, through the laws. So the verse is the Melech establishing. How does he make a civilized society or a civilized empire? So he does it b'mishpat. Through law and order, through justice. This is what he's saying. That's why he gave the example of the Sadim who write the laws. So in other words, this is Malchus. Malchus, that's what Torah Shabbat Peh is. Torah Shabbat Peh takes the written Torah and turns it into laws, into halachas. V'hainu inyan kosher posel. It gives you the laws. This is kosher. This is kosher, and this is off limits, posel. This is what I say. Posel is not posel. This is
nullified.
Okay.
Cancel. Nullified.
Yeah, that's one word. Posel also means this is not proper.
Well, you can say treif, no treif.
Well, treif is in the area. He doesn't here necessarily mean only in food, kosher and treif. He means something is allowed to be done. Muchsher, kosher from the word, it's kosher. In other words, it's fitting, and therefore it's permitted. And posel means it's not. So basically, these are the laws of the land, how a melech establishes, just like a king on earth has a constitution or the laws of the land, and that controls, that governs the whole empire. So the malchus, the rekia, malchus is the same thing. Malchus establishes an order through mishpat, and that's what Torah Shabbat Peh talks about. What's kosher and what's not kosher, what's allowed, what's not allowed. For example, kosher and puzzle. What makes a sukkah kosher and what makes a sukkah psul? So you find these expressions all the time. That a sukkah, for example, of 2 walls is possible. A lulav, if it doesn't have certain features, is possible, meaning it's not fitting, not allowed. It's not illegitimate. It's not allowed to be used. Same thing with all the different laws of kosher and possible. V'hainu, and now he's going to explain al pi Chassidus. What does this mean in Chassidus? What does it mean that something is kosher, something is not? V'hainu. Psak. Psak means a legal ruling al hanetzutzes elu, on the sparks that are on these different objects. Sheyachlu l'haisalus, that this psak, the Torah Shabbat Peh, is giving us a ruling on which sparks are capable of being elevated, and those things are kosher. Ve'elu she'enim yechelim lalis, and which sparks are not capable of being elevated, and that makes them possible. Because what indeed is the problem with certain, if a sukkah, let's say, doesn't have schach, or a sukkah has other things that passel it, what's wrong with it? So legally, it's because it's not technically a sukkah, but in ruchnius it means that even though that there are sparks that are there, but they can't be elevated this way. So for example, something that's off limits, like he says in Tanya, I think he's going to quote Tanya. So Tanya uses the word heter and isur in chapter 7. He says something is mutter or something is osir. What does that mean? Mutter means it's allowed. Osir means it's forbidden, prohibited. So he explains mutter means, well, let's start with osir. Osir means that it's bound. Isur means something is bound, and you're not capable of extracting the sparks. So he's talking osir v'kosher b'yidei achitzenim. The sparks that exist in shalosh klippos atmeis, things that are absolutely forbidden, whether it's macholas asuris, food that you're not allowed to eat, or other things that are forbidden, they all have a divine spark. Nothing can exist without a divine spark. Even though at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, he says that shalosh klippos atmeis ein behem teif klal, they have no good in them. So the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab make it very clear. It says they don't have good mitzad atzmon. On their own, they don't have. But they definitely have a divine spark, but the divine spark is off limits. It would be like it's taken hostage by the negative energy. So even though it's there, you cannot extract it. So that's called, it's being held hostage. Asur b'yidei achitzenim. That's why it's called asur. It's bound, like basically being kidnapped and hijacked, and it cannot be elevated. The Rebbe Rashab even gives an example of chaticha shenasa nevela, a kosher piece of meat that falls into a pot of unkosher meat. So the kosher meat didn't become not kosher, but practically speaking, you no longer can use it because it's now become mixed together with an unkosher. So you can't draw it out. The spark is there, but the spark has become essentially engulfed in negative energy. So that's called what he says, that the netzutzos, you cannot elevate them. What's mutter? Mutter means to untie. Lahatir means to unbind the spark, and that's possible. Devarim mutarim. They may not be a mitzvah, but let's say you take just a kosher piece of food, which is neutral, and you eat it l'shem shamayim, so you're elevating the spark. So there are many things called reshus that are not necessarily forbidden or commanded, and you have the ability to elevate the spark if you use it for good causes, as he explains in Tanya. So he's saying basically Torah Shabbat Peh is like the Sari HaMedina, the people who are teaching Torah Shabbat Peh and learn the Rabbonim and the Talmid Chacham and the Tanoim and Amoraim. They're coming and establishing laws of the land. What are these laws? The laws, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And now he explained what can be elevated, what cannot be elevated. That's what he just said. And who gives this psak? Who does the ruling? Who are the rulers? Who manages these rulings? They are the Tanoim and Amoraim. These are the Tanoim and Amoraim of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Shenikroim Sorim. They are called ministers. Ukamoy ani kesad lefnei hamelech. I am like a minister before the king. It's an expression, and that's what the Tanoim and Amoraim. They're called the ministers. So they're not just performing and not just implementing. They're actually sitting, and that's what they did. They sat and they delve into every verse in the Torah and argue and counter-argue with the goal of clarifying what is the halacha, what are the laws, the psukim, of what is allowed and what is not allowed, what can be elevated, what can't be elevated. The melech b'mishpat yamidoret. So it's true, God gave the general rules in the written Torah, but there are also human beings of flesh and blood, ministers that are on the level of being capable of understanding and evaluating, and they can't just go by Kabolas Oyl. They must use their minds. That's how the Ibishter made it, as he told Moshe Rabbeinu, Achri Rabim Lahatis, you have to have a Sanhedrin, a Supreme Court, and you have to discuss it and argue it out and come to a consensus with your minds. When Moshe said, why can't you just tell us what to do? No, because the Torah is meant to be developed, and there's a partnership going on here. These are the Sodim. Shalehem nitnu. These ministers were given in Yoni HaTorah, the matters of the Torah, sheyach yichtechu v'yivseku b'chachmosim v'daitim v'asagosim b'Torah. That they should, yichtechu means they should clarify, they should tear it apart, you can even say. V'yivseku, and rule with their wisdom, with their chachma, and their daitim v'asagosim. Chachma bina das, chachma das bina. With their wisdom, with their understanding, and with their comprehension in the Torah. Like the disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, which you find in Shas, in the Gemara. And the other Tanoim Amoraim, Shammai and Hillel were Tanoim. And they established the halacha so and so. So Shammai and Hillel, and Beis Shammai and Hillel, have their disagreements. They argue it out until there comes a point where they establish, here's the halacha. And their primary avodah is also b'moichin, means they're using their minds, dafke. The gamkein seems to mean, in addition to their Kabolas Oyl, because they're obviously also doing this because they're accepting God, but they're also using their moichin dafke. Not, in other words, it's not devoid of the mind, of Chabad. They're using their moichin. In general, this level of people are called those that serve God with their souls. Their avodah is in the comprehension of the divine comprehension, and the cleaving and attaching to godliness. This is the level of achesi, sister, because they're standing side by side like partners with the Eibishter, with the Chosn, Malchus. So I know he never finished with Biti, but by comparison, Biti is the Eved, just performing the mitzvahs, Kabolas Oyl alone. And now Achesi is like a partner who's just using their moichin. Remember, Malchus, as it receives from Zohar, not from Chabad. That's what he said earlier. That's the first level of Biti. It's Malchus receiving from Zohar. Now he's talking about Achesi, the level of Achesi. Because the root of these souls are from Atzilus, and they're called brothers and friends, LaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. Shenetzalu im hakelim dezo yachad ma'aba ve'ima. They emanated, and in part of this level of Malchus, with the kelim of Zoh, yachad, equal to Zoh, from Abba ve'ima, from Chachma and Bina, k'meshakoseh ba'bir habeis de Yonossi. Like it says in the second beer of the Maimer Yonossi, this seems to be Likutei Torah, the second beer in the Maimer and Shir Hashirim in Likutei Torah. And that's why they're called brothers, which is also like sister to Zah. I'm going to stop here. The next piece needs a little explanation. So essentially, we have here the Rebbe Rashab has explained both Biti and Achesi. Yes, he did it in somewhat interwoven fashion. He began with Biti as being mitzvos, kalim. He created kalim and primarily Kabolas Oyl, the Eved. That is not involved in writing the laws and using the mind. The Eved just does things based on what they're told. And now he also introduced Achesi, the level of the Tanoim and Amoraim, those that are immersed and involved with their mind to develop the laws and write the laws by the laws which God rules this world based on these halachas in Torah Shebal Peh Malchus. So he didn't finish yet this level of Achesi, because the next piece I'd like to explain more, and we need time for that. So I went a little over, but I'll stop here, and if anybody has any questions. It's pretty straightforward, to be honest, so far. Not that complicated as other things were.
The level of these people that are Achosi, that they're called Sarim. But I thought, and there's a discussion out there, they're the Rabbanim, right? They're the Rabbanim that are making halachas.
Well, he says that here he's calling them Poskim, Tanoim, Amoraim. He didn't use the word Rabbanim, but
Poskim.
Poskim, Tanoim, Amoraim, yeah.
So doesn't the Rebbe always quote the pasuk that they are Malach, Rabbanim, Malach, what's the term?
Man Malka Rabbanon.
Right. So aren't they really, what are they? Are they a Sar or are they a Malach? Melech.
Well, the Melech here is the Eibishter. So in the context of God, they can't be the God. So they are God's ministers. If you're talking about how they are in regard to those that are learning by them or coming to them for a halacha, you call Man Malka Rabbanon, that they're like the rulers of us. We follow their laws, but they follow God's law. So It depends what context you're saying. Ultimately, there's one God, one Melech Malchem Lochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But he's imparted and imparted some of his authority to these Tanoim Amoraim. So that.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
In this context, they are like brothers to God because they are taking God's Torah and writing the laws like those ministers are. So in the bigger context, they're really ministers. But we need to listen to them as if we're listening to Hashem because they are conveying Hashem's will to us. That's their role. And it's due to their bittul, not because they are great people, but because they're bottled to Hashem's ruts. But yeah, that's the point. Okay. So we'll stop here. Close to the end of the paragraph on page 1250. The next few lines need more explanation. That's why I stopped. I would have gone till the end, but I see it's going to take more time than we have. So we'll stop here.